Good morning. So this is about, I just want a disclaimer, it's mental health and advocacy. This is not about diagnosing clients or therapy. This is really a base level about advocacy and what we see as mental health issues and how we as advocates can work with that. So this is, again, very basic level. We have a lot of people who ask questions about that, or they'll say, hey, I have this client that was diagnosed with X, Y, or Z. And so we really wanted to take it down to a baseline level and then kind of build up from there. Jaime and Nora, we wanted to just make this interactive with us about a discussion. They are both doing direct service work now and have at their agencies. They work for a rape crisis center, so it's not a dual agency, and they're seeing sexual assault victims on a regular basis. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Like I said, just some baseline. Do you guys want to say anything? Hi, or
Hi, this is Jaime from RCC. Happy to answer any questions as they come along about advocacy or how we handle counseling in our program.
Yes, and this is Nora, and same, like everyone's covered it.
Okay. So what does advocacy mean? When we look at the WCASA core services and really what is an advocate, an advocate is defined under WCASA and SAVES, which were aligned together. SAVES is the Sexual Assault Victim Services funding. So 24-hour crisis response. And that means going to the hospital. That means going to the police department. It could be coming into your center, depending on where you're at. So it's meeting somebody in a crisis acute situation. Personal advocacy, systems advocacy. So what is an advocate? We kind of do all things for all people. Information and referral. So we're giving the survivors information. We're also connecting them with service providers in our area. So like Planned Parenthood, family planning clinics, those should always be in your back pocket because they need to be referred. Support groups are another really key component to core services because victims often feel alone. They feel like they're crazy or I'm the only one this has ever happened to. And I think gathering support from other people is really important. Accessible services. So are they welcoming, but more importantly for people with disabilities or different issues? Can they come into your center? Community outreach and prevention. This is another key area. When I was talking to Jaime and Nora, and their RCC has, which I think is really fabulous, has advocates that are on site at the colleges in Madison. So they're a community-based sexual assault advocate, but they're on the campuses so that victims of campus sexual assault have an alternative, especially with the Title IX stuff going on. Prevention is really important too. So again, it is the 24-hour kind of crisis response and the advocacy we're going to focus on. I'm just going to hurry up and do these. So what is your role as an advocate? And we're all of these. We go to court. We non-traditional healing, information referral, support, family and friends, emergency contraceptive, breathing, relaxation and grounding techniques, mental health information and referral, information about sexual assault. So all of these things we have to supply on the crisis hotline, but all of these things we have to be to the survivors that we interact with. Oh, we still have more. Dun, dun, dun. And the needs depend on each one of the survivors. Everybody's going to come in with different needs and at a different place in their healing. So let's start with trauma, foundations of trauma-informed services. So let's understanding trauma. Trauma is neurologically based, so the brain chemicals change. And I don't know if you've heard of ACEs, but adverse childhood experiences, and what they're finding is that the more ACEs someone has, the more that's going to impact in their life. So we know everyone who walks through our door has experienced some form of trauma. So we need to create spaces and responses that are trauma-informed and victim-centered. So what does that look like? Understanding the impact of historical trauma and oppression. So we've got commitment to trauma awareness and understanding historical trauma and oppression. So where is that person at right now? And it's strength-based. Recognizing and honoring the individual through your relationship, respect, non-judgmental, collaboration, clear boundaries. So it's providing an atmosphere where they can heal. Trauma-informed care is strength-based. It's grounded in an understanding of trauma. Responsive to the impact of trauma, emphasizes safety, and rebuilds a sense of control and empowerment. And that's really important in working with sexual assault survivors because they had no control and they had no say in anything just by the crime that happened.
I just want to say that empowerment can be done in a lot of different ways, really formal and sort of less formal. So when you're sitting with someone at a hospital, giving them choices about the seat they're choosing to sit in, giving them choices about a beverage to drink or what they want to do next, really giving them back a lot of control and being very explicit about the fact that you are looking to them to make decisions and that you'll support them in any choice they make.
The other thing that I always think about when I think about trauma-informed care and advocacy is really recognizing the ways that those historical traumas and oppressions can impact the way survivors will interact with systems that we interact with a lot. So what someone's identity could mean for them in terms of how they relate to the medical field or to law enforcement, and really recognizing that different survivors are going to have different histories with those systems, and that will impact how they are as survivors.
And so many of, when I was doing direct services, so many of our victims would call the hotline and they did not want to go to the hospital. You know, and so that's why I think that clinics are so important too, just so they can get medically checked and prophylactics and emergency contraceptives. And you're right, the police, so many of them don't want to report. They don't, you know, think that they're going to be believed, and they also are different. It may be different lengths of time since the assault, and so at varying points in recovery or in their healing. So great points you guys had. So I think it's generally believed that trauma has psychological impacts. So what does this look like? So a sexual abuse can lead to depression, overeating, diabetes, and early death. And so if we look at all of those layers and where people are at in the trauma-informed care, so maybe they were a childhood sexual abuse survivor, have depression, there's where the mental health diagnosis comes in. Nobody's checking, hey, were you a survivor of childhood sexual assault? Is this person's not getting out of bed? And then overeating, diabetes. And we got to look at the whole picture, not just one thing. So I want to talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's basically most or all of the rape survivors that we see can fit into these categories. And I'm not trying to diagnose, I'm just saying as a big overarching thing, PTSD is usually what the mental health diagnosis is or what the, we can explain this. So there are 3 categories. Reliving the event, so that's, we've all had clients or phone calls, I keep saying clients, sorry, I'm in therapy mode. We've had survivors that call us and they really feel like they're in the moment. He's here, he's touching me, I can hear him breathing, I can smell, I can whatever, flashbacks. So this is like right there living it. Avoiding the reminders, so I'm not going over a bridge, I'm not going near wherever it happened, I'm never going in an alley, I avoid a blue cover at all cost, and then being on guard. The hypervigilant, you know, that is really looking out all the time, and we see that as a negative, but it's a protective mode of how they're coping. We see symptoms of low self-esteem, relationship problems. So have you ever had survivors that go in and out of relationships that maybe are not the healthiest relationships? They don't feel good about themselves. What do people know about me? And then you've got psychiatric problems. Again, here comes the depression, disassociation, which is like distancing themselves from the event or isolating it, anxiety disorder, self-destructive behavior, alcohol, reckless, unprotected sex, eating disorders, and physical complaints. And I know a lot of the survivors that I have worked with, whether as a therapist or as an advocate, have experienced these symptoms and are in varying degrees going through them. So they may be okay one day and the panic sets in another day, or they have a history of relationship problems and drug and alcohol to cope. So these are all symptoms of a bigger issue. You guys are nodding your head that you see. So do you want to kind of talk about that? About what you guys see when people are coming in to see you?
Sure. I mean, we see absolutely every single one of these symptoms on a daily basis. There's one client in particular in my mind, without releasing too much, I just think about that avoiding reminders piece for her is so significant. So she never discusses the actual assault or the actual event with me. We only talk about those triggers that make her think about all the consequences for her life that have happened since. Mm-hmm. And for her, so much of that is based around school and her education. And she kind of threw herself into studying right after the assault, but now studying has become a real trigger to thinking about how her grades suffered and how she had to withdraw from classes, and she really struggles with being able to do those things that she sort of threw herself into right after the trauma. And now being able to do it in a way that helps to fulfill her, feel healthier, to even just get through a class. So, yeah, just looking at these categories, certainly every single one of these symptoms ring true for a lot of our survivors that we work with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of these, I mean, I think the one that I spend, I don't know if it's the majority, but a lot of time talking about is that low self-esteem and relationship problems. That comes up just a ton, and there's a lot of that is incorporating some of the self-blame, and so then we're seeing kind of the effects of PTSD combined with the rape culture in general and the self-blame of the victim. And then that all ties into trust issues. I think it's like one of the biggest relationship problems I see. So aside from just if there's potentially a history of abusive relationships or unhealthy relationships, but even if that isn't the case, just the fact that a sexual assault occurred can hugely impact their ability to feel like they can trust people going forward or trust themselves. Mm-hmm. I think that's a big component that we work on a lot is like, how do you trust yourself to feel like you can make decisions about people going forward?
Mm-hmm. And how do you actually do that? So do you, like to ground them about self-esteem or trusting themselves or working on relationships? So how would you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously going to be different for everyone depending on kind of like what that base or core belief is that's being triggered. But I think, a lot of it starts with that self-blame piece. And so some of that is kind of actually teasing it out and getting them to realize that that's what's happening, that thought process is like a self-blaming thought process. And then I have a lot of conversations, to be honest, that are, they start out with the survivor saying, well, I think maybe it was like a point of confusion and the perpetrator didn't realize that it was a sexual assault. And then they kind of tell me more about what happened, and then we do some work on like, well, you just told me X, Y, and Z happened, so how was it a point of confusion? And doing that kind of work to say, like, you're putting a lot of this blame on you, but in any reasonable situation, and then also doing some work on, like, what are the definitions of consent and going over that as well. So some, like, basic education around consent, as well as helping do some of that reframing about where they're looking for exceptions to what's happened.
Right. So they're trying not to say, oh, well, or they're looking at it saying, well, no, I'm not a victim. Some of it's my fault. I shouldn't have, wouldn't have, couldn't have, blah, 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 blah. And so many survivors that we all work with, I think, tend to do that. And our society, the rape culture, is that somehow it's their fault. They went to a party, and if you're talking about college-age kids, that I went to a party, I was drinking, I shouldn't have done this, I shouldn't have done that, and that's a lot of it, is that self-blaming. And then, the low self-esteem. And we also do not know where survivors are coming from. So you could have a college-age student that appears functioning, that maybe was assaulted, but you don't know what she grew up in or he grew up in. So you don't know where they're coming from or what kind of environment, if they have healthy coping skills, if they don't. And it takes a long time, and I think education is really important too, like you were talking about, Nora, is just what is the definition, and also giving them some alternatives is here's some healthier coping skills.
I just want to touch on, you talked a little bit, but talk about regaining control for survivors. And I think so much of rape culture is naturally ingrained to us, into our minds and into our behavior and how we think about things. But I think it's also somewhat about, if I hadn't done this, then this wouldn't have happened, and that's kind of a protective mechanism as well. And it's certainly something we see, particularly around friends and family members, often female friends and family members who say, well, I go drinking and I've always been in control, so it's never happened to me. You must have drank too much, or you shouldn't have been doing this. And we frame these things, these blaming statements, as a way of also saying, if you do this or you don't do this, you're safe. And so that's also just kind of our mind's own safety mechanism and protection, but it's not real, it's not valid. And so there's a lot of work on the front end with survivors about, like Nora was saying, dispelling those myths and talking about how if you look at things reasonably, you've gone drinking 100 other times and you've never been sexually assaulted, and you've worn that outfit a million other times. And even if you ran down, I would say State Street because we're in Madison, but if you ran down State Street naked, would that ever give anyone the right to touch you inappropriately, to touch you in a way that you didn't consent to? And so it takes a while, and it's sometimes very direct and sometimes more nuanced, those conversations, but it's definitely important to address those kind of internal self-protection mechanisms that we have. I also think on your list of items, unprotected sex, and just, again, with regaining that control, sexual contact after an assault runs kind of the spectrum from no contact, to or difficulty re-engaging in contact to a really hypersexual behavior, particularly compared to maybe before the assault. And so regaining control over your body, regaining control over your sexual experiences, and kind of re-identifying how you can take control of those pieces. So
I feel like that comes up a lot, and it comes up, especially when someone is experiencing maybe like increased sexual activity after a sexual assault, that feels like it doesn't fit the narrative that we normally have about what a survivor should look like. And so when someone's experiencing that, there's a lot of like, is this normal? What does this mean? And really talking about how that does fit into a normal trauma reaction, and establishing, I mean, and I think even before you're going to get to that point, this is where all of those like trauma-informed things come into play, because you need to establish a safe environment where the person feels like they can tell you that they're doing these. I want to say that like increased sexual activity is always self-destructive, but like potentially like increased drinking or increased sexual activity, because that's going to be a sensitive topic anyways, and feel like they're not going to be judged for it, and feel like they have the ability to ask, like, is this thing that's happening normal, or like, what does that mean?
Right.
So you can then
motivation.
so then you can do that psychoeducation around, like, yeah, that is normal, and actually, like, we see even in like the DSM that like part of PTSD diagnosis now includes more risk-taking behaviors.
Yes, that's a really good thing to bring up, and creating that safe environment where they can talk about, is this normal, is this not, what's different now, and, you know, kind of, okay, so how is life different? And I know that's how I used to ask. It's like, what's different now than was before? And I think so many of them want control because they felt out of control, they had no control, and if they can pick their partners with that hypersexuality, is they're in control because they're picking. And it is an element, and I think we do see that a lot. And some of the other risk-taking behavior, like you said, is now in the DSM, and we're identifying it. So I think if, you know, working with survivors is that psychoeducational at first is like, here's some of the things that you may experience. And, you know, it may be some, none, whatever, but at least to give them a baseline. Oh, I'm not so weird after all.
I think that's super helpful, too, because a lot of times someone will be experiencing that and they don't have any words for it.
Yes.
So when you're kind of going in, you're like, well, one of the things that we could potentially see is hypervigilance, but hypervigilance doesn't necessarily mean something to the survivor.
Right.
So really talking about, like, so it's really common for survivors to be scanning their environment all the time and feeling like they, you know, are having like an increased startle response, and giving those kind of more layman's terms, but also just broaching it, like, hey, is this something you're experiencing? Because that would be really normal. You can tell it's normal because I'm asking you about it.
And I think that is important, is to normalize the feelings there, you know, and to set that environment, and like you said, put it on the table. So, you know, these are just some of the things survivors experience, because you're right, they don't have words for it. It's never happened. And, well, I don't know, what is this? You know, I feel like, you know, the perpetrator is like breathing on me. I'm there, and they don't understand that.
I think that the other thing, too, is like when you are talking about those potential symptoms, really talking about that they can come up at different times for different people. Yes. So, like, hey, this may not be something you're experiencing right now, but it's also, like, perfectly normal if that comes up later on, and that is, you know, different survivors experience these things at different times.
Right.
And so, like, I think, like you were mentioning, I think before we actually started recording, like, in the future, this may happen. Don't, like, it's not abnormal then, and just because you're not experiencing now doesn't mean it won't happen, but also doesn't mean that it's going to keep happening.
Right, right. And just kind of give them a snapshot of, to try to, whatever they're experiencing is theirs. And it is a response to trauma. It's not that, you know, they're like way off in left field. It's that, and everybody goes through this in a different way. We all have different backgrounds. So many survivors that exhibit some of the symptoms of PTSD are labeled with a mental health diagnosis. I know a lot of, when I was doing therapy as a licensed therapist, diagnosing and getting through insurance companies and stuff, is that, you know, it was like adjustment disorder, or it could have been depression, or, you know, a wide variety, but we slap a label on them. And think about some of the survivors that you work with, and how can we help them understand this and work through, or work towards healthy coping mechanisms. I think so many times it's like, oh, well, I've got a depression, I'm depressed, or I'm this, and then, okay, give me some medication, and then they're supposed to be all better. Or that's what they feel society says to them. You know, it's been 6 months since I was assaulted, and I should be here, and they're punishing themselves or saying there's something wrong with me because I can't go back to study, or I can't go past blue cars without panicking or whatever. So how do you guys normalize that, you know, going kind of in and out? You were just talking, Nora, about victims that it's a spectrum, and it's kind of like grief. They come in and out of you know, acute and coming to terms with it, and then go back again. So
I was just going to say, I don't think there is a normal, and I think addressing that from the beginning, that anything you're feeling is normal because it's your body's reaction to something that was not a normal situation for you. It was a traumatic event.
Right.
And so validating the things and sort of preempting, as Nora was talking about, the things that you may experience, and then also saying, and you may experience other things that we haven't identified formally, and it's okay, and we can talk about it and process it, and there is, you know, there is hope on the other side, and you are, you know, we've seen so many survivors get to that place where they're not having reliving trauma every day, and they're not being triggered consistently, but it's a different journey for everyone.
Right.
I think, too, I have like two thoughts, and now I'm trying to remember them both. I think another thing that I talk a lot about with different people in terms of this, like, I'm not where I think I should be, is that there's, that it's just not linear. And then I think a lot of times that thought comes when there's been like a period where the trauma symptoms are coming up less, and then they're coming up more again.
Yes.
And so really normalizing that, and both by just like telling them that that's something that happens all the time, but also kind of exploring with them what else is going on. So is this something where right now there's a whole bunch of other stressors happening in their life? It makes sense that maybe the trauma symptoms are coming up more now when they're under all this other stress in other areas. Or also talking about, because another thing that we see frequently is that maybe in the immediate aftermath there's not a lot of symptoms, and then 6 months down the line they start experiencing the trauma symptoms. And so talking with them about how it's pretty normal as part of the trauma process for your brain to not really start processing through until it feels like it's safe to do that. And so I think this kind of gets to some of the strength-based piece, so really acknowledging with them that, like, this is really hard, but it also means that your brain and, like, your body thinks that you can handle this right now.
Yep.
And so putting it in that context. That's a really good way to phrase
that. I like that.
Yeah. And so you can kind of be like, this is really hard, but, like, your brain wouldn't be doing this if it didn't think you could handle it. And so this is part of it, and we want to make it easier, but, like, this doesn't mean it's forever, and it's just part of the process.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good way of phrasing that. I used to, when I was working with clients, is pain, physical complaints that have so they can't deal with, they're not at that point where they can deal openly with what happened, and so that they may have stomach aches a lot of times. I think women, they tend to have gynecological problems a lot where, or pain, they're experiencing pain. Digestive, sleep disorders are huge. They're either sleeping all the time or they're not sleeping. And they may vary night by night too. But they don't, or headaches, they are not at the place where they can understand that this is part of being an assault victim, that it's coming out in your body because maybe you're not ready yet. And I know when I was doing therapy, a lot of clients that would present with physical complaints, and we were working on stuff, and the physician would say, oh, well, they're histrionic, or they're this, or they're just making up symptoms to get attention. I heard that all the time, and it's like, no, it's coming out in their body, and all of these things are, and that's what I used to tell clients, is your body's reacting. It knows, it remembers, it's the cramps or whatever, it's in your body. And to normalize that, because I think a lot of the outside world doesn't validate that for them, or you know, oh, we're going to do a rule out. Nope, there's nothing wrong with you. You know.
I think there's more and more research on this too,
Yes.
right? Like Bessel van der Kolk and The Body Keeps the Score, where it's like all about your like actually somatic reactions to trauma. But yeah, I mean, I think like seeing these things, it's like I think I tell this to most clients too. Almost everyone that I see has a sleep disorder of some kind. Like sleep is like the #1 thing, and I think that one really sticks around for a long time. It can be really hard to re-regulate that. But with a lot of these things, I mean, if you can think about it even outside the context of trauma, right? Like when we're stressed, we hold it in our shoulders or our stomachs a lot, and it's the same type of thing. And this is where you can kind of start doing some we'll do like progressive muscle relaxation activities or things like that, where you're actually really just like doing body scans to see where that tension is being held, and then addressing it right at the body place. With progressive muscle relaxation activities, I just want to say it's always good to be careful with sexual assault victims, because there may be points where focusing on a certain body part feels very triggering. So I always like to address that with using that particular technique, but it can be really helpful to help release tension in parts of the body that maybe aren't even really registering that you're holding a lot of tension in.
So could you just, maybe there's people that have never heard of that. Can you just talk about that really?
So progressive muscle relaxation is a type of mindfulness technique. It generally involves kind of doing some focusing on your breath first, and then it's a body scan. So you start at like your toes, and there's a couple different ways to do it. You can either just kind of like focus on each individual body part and kind of do an assessment of if you're holding stress there, if the muscles feel tight, or you can do like a more physical one, which would be clenching and unclenching the muscles, which helps if you are holding stress. By clenching tighter and then releasing it, it helps release that. So the ones that sometimes that you can just do like partial ones too, so things like a lot of people hold tension in their shoulders, so things like raising your shoulders up to your ears and holding that and then releasing them down, and you can kind of feel your shoulders go down further if you're holding tension there.
And there's a lot of apps and YouTube videos. I mean, there's so many. You can go online and they will walk you through step by step. And it's great for clients to have sort of those things right on their phone, because it gives them immediate access to some support. So if they can't be with you right away, then they can at least have
That's a great idea. You know, the technology's come so far, and to
there's so many mindfulness apps.
Yes, I talk about those all. I mean, I work with college students, so we're always talking about what you can do on the phone.
But I think that's important, and then to recognize you're holding it into a certain, you know, I mean, our bodies do hold it in, and usually it's in different areas. But to recognize that and to say, here it is, you know, and then being able to physically release it. And they can do that when they're not with you.
Absolutely. And I think, too, that our bodies can really be like the canary in the coal mine for us, where you can not really realize that you're under a lot of stress and tension, and then all of a sudden you're like, I have this headache, or like all of a sudden my shoulders are creeping upwards. And so, you know, as they kind of become more in tune with how their body holds that stress and trauma, they can actually use it as like an indicator of like, oh, hey, like my symptoms might be starting to act up. I might be feeling more stress around the trauma right now, and maybe that means I need to do, you know, these coping mechanisms that I've been letting fall by the wayside that I haven't been doing.
And I can help you identify triggers. Sometimes people aren't even aware of the things that are triggering them, and so they're constantly kind of in a cycle of re-triggering themselves. I also, just as you guys were talking about all of these physical disorders and complaints, we know just from the chart you showed before around ACE scores, when people have trauma, it results in chronic health issues. And so validate all of that and look for ways to support them in creating healthy coping skills and combating some of these you know, these
Well, and this too, right, like all of these things kind of tie into each other. So if you're having chronic health problems, that's a huge life stressor.
Yeah.
And so then that is probably has the potential to trigger some of the trauma because you're under a lot more stress. And so then we get into this kind of cycle.
Right. And helping them to move, or at least gain the skills to kind of move out of there, or to recognize that they're in it. Because so many people, when they're in it, they're just chugging away and trying to survive, and they're not realizing, oh, well, here it is, here I am again, or, you know, so I think that stop, at least check your body, and then recognizing that is really important. And I think for sleep, I used to, when I would work with survivors, it was like have a routine. It is so important. It's almost like parenting again. You know, they tell you with your kids to have a routine, but I think as survivors, it's important, whatever makes them feel safe. So I had clients that they would check the locks. They go around, okay, and then like soothing music, what works for them. And if they do the same thing in their mind, you know, whatever, listening to a program or music or whatever they needed at the time, but to do that every night. Relaxation, breathing is another one, and really feeling safe. I mean, that's the most important thing, whether it's a blanket or, you know, whatever it is to them, it's helping them identify what those are, and then setting up kind of routines.
The other thing that I feel like comes up that's like exactly related to this is that one of the big sleep things that happens is nightmares, and so having almost like a routine or plan in place for reestablishing safety after you've experienced a nightmare, and having that just be something that's already planned out, so that you are not in this place where it's 3 a.m. and you're awake and it's very scary and you don't feel like you have these touchstones. So having like this is my nightmare plan, this is how I'm going to reestablish safety, and it can tie into those kind of general nighttime activities of how we establish safety around sleep, but just like providing a plan so that they can kind of accept that a nightmare may happen and that's okay, and this is my plan to get back to sleep.
And there's control and empowerment, because this is my plan. If it happens, I'm ready, or I feel empowered to do it. Turn on the light, breathe, whatever they need to do, get a cup of tea, and establishing that routine. Yeah, that's a good thing too. So we're going to kind of shift a little bit. Rape trauma syndrome. It's a type of PTSD that was identified probably about 20 years ago, because I've been in the field about 30-something now, and that was just coming in about 20 years ago when they were identifying. The people actually, you know, could get raped, and it was marital rape could actually happen. So there are 3 stages. The acute stage, immediately when it happens, the outward adjustment stage, and Nora, when you were talking about people, you know, moving in and out, this is where they're moving in and out of these stages. And then the resolution stage. So what is the acute stage? It's usually immediately after. It may be weeks where they're appearing normal, so the assault happens, or something triggers them, and you know, they just kind of go on with life, and then all of a sudden something happens where it's triggered again to be back into this stage. And we've all had medical advocacy where you're walking in and somebody is crying hysterically, or they're like silent. And nothing, laughing. I've had the survivors that were like laughing, and you could tell it was like an out-of-control laugh, or acting like nothing happened, not showing emotion, numbed down. And so this is the acute stages. It's immediate, and they, again, go in and out of these stages. And police in this acute stage usually, when we would have police come in and they're like, well, a victim shouldn't look like that. They shouldn't be laughing. They shouldn't, whatever it is. And it's like, no, anything's normal. And telling the survivor that what you're feeling is normal and it's yours. So the outward adjustment stage, so victims are resuming what appears to be normal life, and you were talking about that, maybe 6 months. They don't need anything for 6 months. They're not doing anything for 6 months. There's no symptoms. So, however, the following symptoms can still occur is change in lifestyle, phobias, mood swings, and they're just not putting 2 and 2 together that is part of the assault. And then resolution stage. So moving from a victim to a survivor, so feeling more empowered. The rape is no longer the victim's central focus. And again, I think they come in and out of this because they may get to healthy functioning, and then something stressors. You've got midterms, you've got finals. Am I going to get into the graduate program? Am I going to get this job? My kid is stressing me out. I don't have money, or whatever it is, and boom, they're right back to where they were. So in the resolution stage, it becomes another event in their life. It doesn't consume them. I think for a while when I worked with survivors, they're living and breathing, and it is like all encompassing. There's nothing else. There's no room for anything else for a while. And I think in varying stages of healing, that is also true. And you guys are nodding your head, so obviously.
We're very bad at audio format.
Yeah.
Those counselor skills.
Yeah. So can you talk about, you've had, survivors that have gone in and out, or how that's affected?
Yeah, I also think, just to start with it, just having this language around what these stages look like can be really helpful for people, and kind of letting them know about the stages can be really helpful. I talk to a lot of people about the resolution stage, and particularly this integration piece where it just becomes another event, and that it's not this all-consuming thing, because I think for a lot of people when they're in that, it feels like that's going to go on forever. And so when we talk about what does it look like when you're kind of at a place where you feel healed, or you're in recovery from this, and talking about this isn't going to go away 100%. This is something that happened to you, and it was a big event, and we're going to acknowledge that, but we're also going to acknowledge that there's going to be a point down the road where you're not thinking about this all day, every day, and that's the point that we're kind of going towards.
That's a really good thing, too, that you're not always, because sometimes it's just having them hold on, that this is not going to be my life forever, because it feels like that at the time. It's like, I'm there, it's living, breathing in me, and I can't think of anything, I can't function.
And then, what was the other point I was going to make? Yeah, just recognize, I think, and this is, talked about this a bit before with the stressors, but talking about how those stressors can kind of push back in other stages. In August, I think, when everyone was moving here in Madison, I cannot believe how many people I was seeing that just felt like they were, I don't want to call it a backslide, but I think they would have called it a backslide, where it just feels like they were in much more acute trauma, and it's because moving is a huge life event. And also I think pointing out to people what those other stressors can be, because sometimes they're positive things. When we look at those life stressor things, someone could be getting married, and it can bring up all sorts of trauma and stress, and it's not because that's a bad thing that's going on for them, it's just because that's a big change. And so then it comes up, and they're but nothing bad is happening.
Right.
And so kind of helping point out those things, and also pointing out that it isn't a backslide just because you are now in an acute stage again, or in an outward adjustment stage instead of a resolution stage. It doesn't undo all of the progress that you've made already, and you're going to get back there, and this just means there's something else that you needed to kind of sort through and process through, and this is just another part of that healing journey that we're on.
I really like the language you use, is that this is just another part of your journey, and you know, it's not about backsliding. It's just this is where you're at, and there's, you know, there can be happy stress too, but yeah, part of this journey that we're going on, because it is recovery and is a journey, and working with survivors and for their own healing, it is a journey. So when we're working with survivors, I think it's really important to say it's about what happened to them, not what's wrong with them. So what's wrong with you that you couldn't, you know, handle? You're getting married, instead of looking at something, and that's that trauma-informed lens we look through too. It is a positive, and it's not about what's wrong with them. And this is something that happened to you. So, and I think it's very important to establish that too. So we talked about like a bedtime thing, but I always worked with survivors about a self-care plan, because you know, I think as human beings, we're not real good at taking care of ourselves. We don't think, well, we deserve it, especially if you have a survivor who is self-blaming, and then it's like, well, no, you know, I'm fine. I don't need to take, you know, the time out for myself. And I think working on a plan, sometimes putting stuff in writing is really important. And it's hard for some people, I think, to figure out what they can do for themselves and allow themselves to do it.
And being proactive and repetitive about those plans. So
yes.
Not waiting until you're feeling like you're stuck in the thick of it. Yes. Putting self-care first, and not, if something doesn't work the first time, give it a few more cycles. Try it a few more times and see if it helps, because sometimes it is the repetition and getting your body used to creating some sort of self-care plan or some sort of new normal when you're having triggers, to ground yourself in the moment. So being proactive and repetitive, I think, is really important.
And the other thing I always think of with self-care plans is kind of having multiple strategies for what the self-care plan looks like. So, you know, at some points in time, self-care is going to look like doing your mindfulness work or journaling about this. And at other times, it's going to look like I'm going to sit down and do a Netflix binge, because that's what I have capacity to do right now. And so it's really allowing room for both those types of things. So giving someone permission to feel like they don't have to think about the trauma for a while, and saying, like, that's okay, and if that's what you need, you can do that. Or like with students, like, if you acknowledging like how much work trauma processing is, that's another piece that I talk about with self-care plans, which is like, hey, like, this isn't just nothing. This takes energy, and this is taking brain power. So we can recognize that that's another huge thing on your plate. You're doing like full-time school, or you're doing full-time work, or you're a parent, and you've got all of those normal just like activities that are draining energy. But then on top of that, you're dealing with trauma processing, and that is basically like a full-time job as well. And so you deserve to have times where you can just check out. And so kind of creating a plan, or one of the things that I'm going to talk about with college students a lot is like having actually like scheduled self-care time. So I think we can get into, anyone can get into this thing where you're like, I feel like I'm burnt out, and but I don't want to take the time out to take care of myself, and so now I'm worried about not doing my work, but also not doing anything to take care of myself, and then nothing's getting done. So really kind of actually having like, I'm going to block an hour, and I'm not allowed to do work during that time, and I can do, you know, one of these many activities that we figured out, but this is already booked into my schedule, so it's not like I'm taking away from my study time or from my whatever time. This time is actually set aside for self-care.
And I think that's a really good idea, and sometimes survivors don't feel like they are worthy of that I mean, so often it's like, well, no, they're, you know, oh, I can't do that, or my kids have to come first, or, you know, and they feel like less than, so they feel like they don't deserve that.
Yeah, I think it's important to help them recognize like the little things that they might already be doing for self-care. Like, what are they doing that's helping them get through? Because this is hard. There's probably, I mean, I would imagine for almost everyone you're going to be able to find something, even if it's really small, that they're doing, because they are getting through each day. So there's got to be something that's kind of like helping them get through, and helping identify that, and then helping them connect it to the belief that they have some sort of self-value.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So we've talked about like stress reducers, so the breathing and, you know, feet planted on the floor and really concentrating on breath is one thing to kind of ground survivors, and do something for the kid in you, and that's that deserving, or it could be something small like, you know, like binge watching, you know, something, or I deserve that. Relaxing tapes when you drive or you walk or you know, whatever. And exercise, I think, is important too, because it helps with chemicals in the brain at the same time as kind of like a physical release too. And just keep a folder of your favorite cartoons or humorous notes on hand. And that's something I do. Like, I post them in my office. I think all of us can be better at reducing stress. You know, people in the field too, not just survivors, but all of us. Rent a movie, I like that, or go to the movie. Any other suggestions that you guys would have for survivors, or people can like work with survivors?
I'm doing so much advocacy now, and so people are just coming to terms usually when I'm working with them, so you have much more of the ongoing experience.
Yeah, I mean, I like to do like exploration with the person around kind of like what they connect with. But I've had clients who really like quotes or like inspirational quotes, and so like helping find things like that or connect them with literature. Sometimes that's about like survivor stories or something that feels empowering in that genre, but sometimes just like quotes, or sometimes it's just reminding them of the things that they already do. So like, hey, you really like ice cream and you feel better when you eat that. So like when you're having a really hard week, like saying like, I hope that you remember to get some like ice cream this week. One of the other, I guess, like more skill-based ones that we talk about in terms of like a stress reducer grounding technique would be like a five senses activity. So we do that occasionally, and that can be helpful. And so that would look like practicing with them, going through kind of each of their senses and identifying things around the room that they're interacting with. So like listing 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can touch. I can never remember the order of the senses. 4 things that you can touch, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. And that can be, so that's a grounding activity that can be really helpful in those more like acute stages where someone's experiencing a flashback. So it pulls you back into, again, it's tying into the body, right? So it pulls you back into your body in the present safe space as opposed to that experiential flashback where you're feeling like you're back in the moment. And so really doing that, but it's also a mindfulness technique that can be helpful even like later on, just as practice.
Well, it's great if you can practice in the session or end a session with some self-care so that they're leaving feeling a little bit more balanced, and so that they have some of those tools and skills that you're practicing regularly. I also think oftentimes clients think like, oh, I can call my friend or I can call my mom and talk to them, but what happens if that person doesn't answer their phone or they're not available? So thinking about things that they can do very independently and making sure they have plans that don't involve them feeling more guilt because they feel like they're putting it on other people.
Yes, that's a biggie too.
Well, and this is, I mean, something that, you know, I remind my clients about all the time is like, this is where helplines come in, because this is really kind of like normalizing that in session and saying, like, you know, when it's 3 a.m. and you wake up from a nightmare and you don't want to bother mom or whoever with this because it's 3 a.m. and they're sleeping, you can call the helpline, and that's people that want to talk to you. Like, they are not going to be bothered. You are not disturbing them. That's what they're there for, and kind of talking through that and really giving them permission to make those phone calls. And also, I think, as a resource even outside of those times, because it's like, well, this isn't someone that you're burdening in your life. This is someone that's like there expressly for this purpose, and you can do the like work around like not feeling like a burden as well, but just for in the moment to kind of ease up on that feeling of here's a resource so you don't even have to address that part of the equation. And
some of the survivors I worked with too, they don't have a lot of healthy support around them. So it's helping them identify what kind of supports, and if they don't have them, so like you said, that independence, so how can the helpline, or how can I do this myself? And the 6 months down the line, somebody might not want to continue to hear your girlfriend that you're calling in the middle of the night. It's like they think rape victims should be, oh, well, what are you doing? It's been 6 months.
You're better by now, right?
Yeah, you should be. You know, it's been a year or whatever, and they're not understanding that. And so I think it's, you know, because that whole burdening someone too. I talk to programs about, especially the nurses that'll say, do you want an advocate? Well, who knows what an advocate is?
They don't know what that means.
And,
they don't want to burden anyone.
Right. Don't wake anybody up at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's kind of the same thing for a survivor, is just saying, we are here for you. We're awake already. So,
we're waiting to be served. Yes.
And to have that ability to do that, I think that is so important as an additional resource. So we're going to kind of wrap up. So are there additional like tidbits that you guys can think of we haven't touched on?
I think just going back to mindfulness and just how important that really is, and there are more and more studies these days that are coming out about meditation and the importance of being able to be proactive in meditating daily or creating safe spaces for yourself. And so just can't highlight enough the importance of really giving grounding techniques, helping clients to download apps or know where to find things, even if they can't get to a helpline or they can't see you in the moment, but really being proactive, again, in all of those self-care techniques and knowing that it's okay, as Nora was saying before, if you have a backslide or if you go back to a step that you thought you had already passed, it's okay, and moving forward might be faster this time.
Right. And building on strengths. I always think of it as building blocks. Yeah. Because you're here, even if you slid, you're still up here. Now, next time you'll be higher.
Yeah. The other thing, this is unrelated, but the other thing that I think we talked about kind of tangentially is and this is about that control piece too, is really spending a lot of time like working with people on kind of exploring their options in terms of what they want to do. So I think we talked specifically advocacy-wise, so like exploring around like what does reporting look like? What does that mean for you? What are you hoping to get out of that? And then also doing that kind of work with them to say like, you know, you're not making that decision for them, but you're helping them kind of think through it. So what does it look like if you go through this whole process and the person isn't found guilty? How does that feel? Are you still going to feel like you've got something out of the process from doing it, or is it going to feel worse if you're in that stage? And then at the same time, what happens if they are found guilty? Are you going to have like done the healing process where then it feels worse because now you're like, I'm not better and I thought this would make me better? So kind of doing before they even start the processes, working with them so that they really feel like they've had an opportunity to think through it, and it emphasizes that control piece, right? Because then they feel like they're making an informed decision. So giving them kind of all of the facts that you know. Having a conversation with someone of like, this is what getting a restraining order looks like. We're going to go to this place. We're going to fill out these forms. We're going to go to this place. Then they're going to set this court date. This person may be in the room at this point in time, and just kind of using your knowledge of what those systems look like, because while we work in these systems every day, as like all of the survivors that we work with, for the most part, have never been in this before. So, and it's confusing. It's confusing to know what is happening in the emergency room when you go in for a sexual assault exam or go in to get a restraining order. So intimidating to go talk to law enforcement. So kind of talking about what it looks like ahead of time and really like talking through kind of what the different options are, because it's really easy to get kind of a narrow focus and to just help them kind of expand out to feel like they aren't blindsided by any of these processes.
And I think when we're doing training like at SAVIS, that decision that is made when they're entering, let's say they're at the hospital for a SANE exam, and if they're reporting to law enforcement, it then gets taken out of their hands. And so there are life decisions that are made, and it's slowing the process down. And nothing should be done until an advocate gets in that room and really, as much as the survivor can, help them understand. And I am so grateful that we have anonymous reporting, that they can collect the forensic evidence from their body, and that they can have like a day or two or a week or whatever they need, because they're in acute stage. They're traumatized, and then they're making these life-altering decisions. And, you know, that is so important.
And I think that's, I mean, when I go and do medical advocacy, I find myself just repeating over and over again, like, this isn't something you have to choose right now. Like, your decision can be that you don't know yet. And we can get all of this medical stuff done. They can collect evidence if you want. But even if you don't want that to happen, it doesn't mean you can't report later.
Right.
And so really focusing on, like, there's lots of options, and it's also okay to not choose an option right now.
Right. And we're lucky in the state, I mean, that we have the anonymous kids, that now there is a process for that, because there wasn't, kind of depending on where you were at in the state before, and, you know, kids being left on shelves and everything, but that they don't have to immediately make that decision. And I think the more we can empower victims, and they can have the power to make choices and do that, the better off we are. And Jamie, I heard you say, well, I'm not working so much long-term with clients, it's more acute. It sounds like more medical advocacy and kind of immediate.
Well, and I have some clients that I see more long-term for advocacy, but I'm not doing as much of the counseling piece as Nora, so she's really given great insights today.
And yes, you have. This is wonderful. And you know, a lot of advocates that I talk to, it's like, what's the difference between, you know, like counseling or advocacy and therapy? And what the stuff that we're talking about today is counseling. It is advocacy. It is, you don't have to be a licensed therapist. This is not a therapy processing. And so as an advocate, we can do this. We can, you know, do everything we've talked about today. I think there are, and that's another webinar, but there are times when I think somebody may need an outside referral. And, you know, what does that look like? But so many times advocates are afraid that, well, I'm not a therapist, or they're overstepping their bounds, where it then becomes, instead of psychoeducational, it becomes a processing, you know, thing when you're meeting with them. And so I think, you know, helping to clarify, both of you, I thank you for coming in, because I think this is really important.
And this is something that, like, we at the Rape Crisis Center have a therapist referral binder, and it includes, like, information on common trauma therapies, so that when a client is looking for something that is more diagnostic, treatment-based, we can say, you know, these are the options, and we can do that advocacy kind of role in that way too, where we're like, we're going to help you make an informed referral, because getting a mental health professional
Yes.
is incredibly daunting, and that can be something that we work on as well, of figuring out what you're looking for and what works with your insurance, and doing all of those things so it's not like this huge 100-person anonymous list.
Right. And continuing to work with them as their advocate, and not saying, oh, well, I can't, work with this person because, oh my gosh, they've got this or that. It's, I will stay here and I will provide this, and this person is going to provide this part.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so some of our therapeutic referrals are for, PTSD or trauma therapy, but some of them, too, it's because there's other mental health issues going on. And so really having a conversation that's like, this is outside of our scope, but I don't want, we don't need to stop working on kind of this sexual trauma piece, but let's find you someone that can work with the other issues that I don't have the experience to work with you on.
Right.
And I think it's advocates' responsibility to really be connected in the community, to know who's out there, know your resources, be connected with those multidisciplinary teams, and be really proactive in knowing the names of the therapists and the really good trauma therapists in your area. And
if there are any.
If there are any. I know we are so lucky in Madison to have resources.
Because there are many rural areas that there are no therapists. And, hospital's 100 miles away. And so it's like, how can I be there for this, this part of it, but I can't do therapy. And having those boundaries within yourself, too, to understand the difference, and, with the survivors.
I think having and feeling like you can have those conversations with the person to say, this really is not something that I can professionally do with you, and it's not because I'm rejecting you, it's because this goes outside of the scope of what I can competently serve you as, and I want you to get the best service possible, and I can't provide that for this issue.
Right. So we're going to open it up. Any questions? We haven't had any so far.
Just type them in your chat or questions box, and we'll read them off. We'll give you a few seconds to type them in.
Well, I want to say I don't see any questions. Boy, everybody must really know everything. But thank you for Jaime and Nora joining me in this conversation. And, I think it's really important. And you guys are doing great work. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.